This is Local Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance at our Capitol Bureau today in Sacramento. We are joined by Carlos Marquez. He is the Senior Political Director for the California Charter Schools Association. And sir, there's no doubt that charter schools continue to be in the news a great deal. I want to get a sense for our viewers. What's the difference between a charter school and a magnet school?
Great question, Brad. Well, essentially the difference is charter public schools are exactly that. They're public schools that are tuition free, and that they've been freed from a lot of regulations that exist within the Education Code, which is essentially the framework of law that governs public education in California, which allows us to realize a number of innovations in the classroom that help us really push through some of the hardest challenges that face us in terms of educating some of our sort of toughest populations in the state. A magnet school is still very much governed by a school board and a school district, and are also, subject to the regulations within the Ed Code, but they are given some freedoms.
And with regard to charter, as I understand it, children are admitted to charter schools purely through lottery. It's that simple. You cannot apply to be in a charter school. I mean, the application puts you into a lottery, essentially.
Right. So we are, again, public schools, and as such, we are required to accept all students, irrespective of their race, their gender, their academic performance, and frankly, we're a non-sectarian system as well. So again, making sure that we're making room for everybody, but you brought up a really critical point, which is the lottery. We have lotteries because we simply don't have enough high-performing seats, and we don't have enough high-performing seats available for parents who want to place their children in charter schools, because there's a political environment that has unfortunately, placed a barrier between students and parents and their education.
And let's talk about that, because it's hard to deny that charter school growth is explosive, despite the winds that may be pushing against it. When you think about the number of kids in charter schools, about 600,000, that's probably about 10% of all kids in public schools in California, just under. In Los Angeles County, over 100,000, I should say LAUSD, over 100,000 children are in charter schools. I want to get a sense about where charters seem to be seeing their most growth.
Sure, I think that's a great question, because it goes at what we believe our core mission. We want to make sure that we're making options available for families who've been left behind by the traditional system, so that their kids can achieve in school, matriculate, and get ahead in life. And those kids continue to fall into the same groups that we've seen for the last 30 years. Black, Latino students, students who are English language learners, students who are on free and reduced lunch, and students with disabilities.
What I think is fascinating, and in some ways supports what you're describing, when you look at charter public school enrollment versus traditional district school enrollment, free and reduced lunch, about 59% of the state, falls into that category for traditional schools. For charter, about 56%. So you're basically at the same level. If you saw those numbers much lower, at least on the charter movement, it would play into the narrative that charter schools are for rich kids. And those that are disadvantaged don't know how to navigate the system.
Well, it's a debate that we're constantly fighting against, and there are political headwinds that we believe that we're pushing up against, but for the right reasons. But when you look at concentrated data in LA Unified, as you mentioned, we do have a much larger share of students on free and reduced lunch, English language learners, Latino students, Black students in poverty, than the traditional public school system. And frankly, and because you mentioned magnets earlier, we have a much greater share than magnet schools with regard to taking on the burden of educating students who fall into those categories.
So how have you gotten the message out to communities that tend to not receive these types of messages. Like, for example, I think about the Affordable Care Act and how hard it was to penetrate certain communities of color when the Affordable Care Act just rolled out. Now, communities of color are, or even economically disadvantaged.
Sure.
But somehow the message is out because when you look at economic disadvantage, when you look at ethnic breakouts, the numbers essentially mirror what we see with traditional schools.
Sure. Well, in these communities, if something's working, and again, for many of these families, charter public schools have become a lifeline for their students, word gets around fast.
Right. Good news travels fast.
And parents are voting with their feet and listening to their friends and their family who've had great experience in charters and seeing those students, again, matriculate and succeed in life. And so, they're really asking us to create more high-performing seats for those families, and that's exactly what we're trying to do.
What about the concern that charter schools, as they continue to flourish, they hurt the underlying districts? And you hear cries of bankruptcy, that if this movement continues, we will not see traditional public schools thrive.
Right. Well, no one's more interested in strengthening the public education system in California than we are. No one's more interested in strengthening the public education system than we are, and I would say that we believe that we have to adopt a sense of urgency around educating the students in our system who are most vulnerable that we simply do not see reflected in the traditional system.
But how do we get to a place where it doesn't feel adversarial?
Well, I do think that you're seeing the outlines of a consensus building in places like LA, places like Oakland, population centers that have, and districts that have had to contend with an upsurge of charter growth in the last decade. And you're starting to see a coalition of civil rights organizations and education organizations, foundations and philanthropists, and of course the district and educators who are within the district come together and try to fix the most vexing issues that face our students. We are simply saying, hey, let's take an all of the above approach to public education. Among those approaches that work best, we have found that traditional public schools, where traditional public schools are falling short, charter public schools are really exceeding
But interestingly, Berkeley came out with a study recently out of looking at LAUSD. It was December 2015. And what they found in terms of academic growth was seen at charter schools in the elementary grades, definitely in the middle school grades, but in high school, not as much. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that our high school sites are actually fewer throughout the state than you see in our middle school and our elementary school sites, and we simply have not had as much a long runaway as we've had in those lower levels.
Why is it that we see more charters at the lower grades and not in the high schools?
Well, we've been trying to develop a long-term pipeline, and of course high schools are at the end of that pipeline.
Oh, I see. So they start as, they start in kindergarten, they add a year, and we're just part of the charter school movement is fairly young.
So you usually bracket on grades as you go along.
Okay, his name is Carlos Marquez. I'd love to have you back and talk more about the future of the charter school movement. Of course, he is the senior political director of the California Charter Schools Association. My name is Brad Pomerance. We are in Sacramento today in our Capitol Bureau, and this is Local Edition.